So on June 8th, Donald Trump has been charged in a DOJ inquiry related to the classified documents he had stored at Mar-a-Lago, some of which included national security information, including intel on the United States' nuclear weapons programs. And this indictment is much more serious than the Alvin Bragg hush money payments from the Manhattan DA a few months ago. This is much more serious, and it really raises a serious question. What is the actual future for Donald Trump and his 2024 presidential bid? Because you now have a candidate running for office, a former president who's been indicted twice, is going to be indicted in the near future. You've got the Georgia election probe, involving Brad Raffensperger and all that. And then you've also got the whole fake electors scheme, which I think might be related to the Georgia one. It might be a separate investigation, but either way, Donald Trump is going to be indicted again after these two indictments, and it really puts the Republican Party in a very difficult position because their leading candidate is currently under federal investigation, and at the same time, he's polling 30 points above any of his competition. And this really raises a whole host of questions. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the Trump indictment briefly, but we're also going to talk about what the future holds for Donald Trump. Whether or not he's going to continue to campaign with these indictments, if he's going to win the nomination, and ultimately, if he could win the presidency under federal investigation and facing these multiple indictments. So, of course, if you're new to the channel, before we begin, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So needless to say, this is completely unprecedented for the United States, for presidents to be under federal investigation like this, facing criminal charges. It's never happened in the history of the United States. The closest we got to that, of course, was Richard Nixon with the whole Watergate scandal. But of course, Gerald Ford famously pardoned him for the betterment of the nation. And Nixon stepped aside for the betterment of the nation, something Donald Trump has decided he's not going to do. So with him really in the limelight and still sort of the head of the Republican Party and conservatism more broadly in the United States, it really raises the question, how long could Donald Trump continue this while he's under indictment? Because these are some serious charges he's facing, especially in this second indictment. And he really brought this all on himself. The first indictment, of course, goes back many years, and that's a more complicated history, but it's not nearly as serious as this second indictment here, related to, of course, the federal documents. Now, to summarize extremely briefly, Donald Trump had some documents in his possession that were classified. The federal government asked for the documents back. Donald Trump turned over some of the documents and then claimed that was all that he had. Of course, the FBI knew differently. And of course, Donald Trump not only lied about having the documents, but also tried to obstruct federal officials in their process to get the documents. So that's really how we ended up here with this indictment in a very brief synopsis. Now, looking at 2024, as I mentioned, Donald Trump is by far and away the leading candidate for the Republican primaries. And it's not really a real mystery given the fact that Donald Trump has cultivated this extremely loyal and borderline fanatical base over the past 7 or 8 years. Really people that believe that Donald Trump is the savior of America, that only Donald Trump can restore America, make America great again. And that sort of rhetoric resonates with the Republican base to the point where even despite all of this, Donald Trump is still by far and away the leading candidate for president in 2024. Now, in a different era, being indicted by the federal government would be disqualifying for a candidate for office. But of course, we are in a much more polarized, hyper-political era in which you have a candidate like Donald Trump who has a really fervent base. At this point, 30 to 40% of the Republican Party as of now that will never leave him no matter what, that thinks anything Donald Trump is accused of is a hoax, a witch hunt, etc., etc. And when you have that mentality, it's not hard to see that Donald Trump is still leading the Republican pack despite everything. And I think part of that has to do with the other candidates not really offering a strong alternative. Again, a lot of Donald Trump's policy ideas are very popular. Securing the border, protecting American jobs at home, opposing foreign wars. These policies are popular now with the Republican base, something that would be basically unthinkable in the Republican Party of 2003, just 20 years ago. But of course, here we are, and the Republican Party is much different today because of Donald Trump and his movement. That much is indisputable. But, looking ahead at where 2024 holds, we still have most of the primary season to go. It's only June of 2023. We've got about 6 months until the Iowa caucuses and the first primary states in Super Tuesday. So there's still a lifetime of politics until those caucuses and primaries. So Donald Trump very well could be out of the race by then, although he's vowed to stay in the race as long as physically possible. Now, interestingly enough, United States law doesn't bar a candidate running for office because of criminal charges. In fact, Eugene Debs, who was a socialist candidate for president back in 1920, ran his presidential campaign from a jail cell. And he was actually arrested under the same act that Donald Trump is currently being charged under, the Espionage Act, which was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson during World War I. Now, when we look at Donald Trump's favorability ratings, he really has a floor of about the mid to high 30s, even low 40s. And it's really unclear how these indictments are going to change that. Again, I think this is going to turn off a lot of independents, a lot of Republicans on the fence, but Donald Trump still has a fervent base in the country. And it's about 25% of the U.S. population, I'd argue, that are diehard Trump supporters no matter what at this point. Again, there's always things that can come around to erode that, but Donald Trump has to navigate a very difficult climate now because he's facing federal indictment. He's not popular nationwide, and he's currently running to try to defeat an incumbent president who in his own right is very unpopular, but he doesn't have nearly as much negative press coverage as Trump does. He certainly doesn't have these federal investigations, although there is some House investigation into Joe Biden, which maybe we'll talk about in a future video if it becomes relevant. But things are not looking good for Donald Trump in the short term, especially given the fact that these charges could actually land him in prison, and this BBC article sort of covers that, of course, related to the federal documents. It was a 37-count indictment, and Donald Trump could go to jail. The indictment notes that the charges carry a maximum term of imprisonment of 10 years. So even if Donald Trump is in jail for 10 years, that's still massive, and of course makes a lot of liberals in America very happy that Donald Trump is finally behind bars. But again, this was something that was extremely preventable. Obviously a lot of these investigations against Trump do have a partisan motive. You have Democratic DAs and partisans that of course want to be the ones to take down Donald Trump once and for all, but there's obviously some there or else there wouldn't be a case. And in this federal documents case, if Trump had just handed over all the documents from the beginning, this would have never happened. Now, Joe Biden, Mike Pence, a couple of other officials had classified documents in their possession. As soon as they were notified, they handed them over, and that was that. Of course, Donald Trump didn't do that, though. He didn't hand over the documents. He lied about it, said he didn't have any more. And then, of course, that leads to the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago, where they found tons of classified documents he was holding back. So that's really where we are today. I'm not sure how long this process is going to take, whether or not Donald Trump is going to jail. At this point, it looks very likely, at least, that Donald Trump is going to have some sort of probation, prison time in the future. The question is, will this come before 2024? How much will this actually impact the election? So far, the first indictment really hasn't done anything. Now, this indictment is a lot more serious. Many Republicans were very quick to defend Donald Trump. Basically, every Republican running for president, barring maybe Asa Hutchinson and partly Kristi, rushed to defend Trump over these charges before we even knew anything about them. And now that, of course, there is more information about them, it's a lot harder to defend in the public sphere. And, I think as a strategy for these Republicans to sort of defend their leading opponent, while it does show that the base is definitely in line with Trump, I don't really think strategically it's the smartest move. I think Kristi's statement was probably the best, advocating for a more wait-and-see approach, obviously calling for fair justice, but of course not rushing to judgment like other candidates did, like Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, etc., etc. So will we actually have a mainstream party candidate running for president while in a prison cell? Well, obviously it looks like that's very likely going to be the case, and I think Trump's not going to drop out until it's absolutely necessary. Now, of course, this begs other questions as to how the RNC is going to react to this. Ronna McDaniel, of course, the primary process, given the fact that they have to be aware that having a candidate that is under indictment is going to be a massive electoral liability, not just in the presidential race, but all down the ballot. If Donald Trump is the nominee against Joe Biden with these charges and potentially more charges down the road, it's going to be almost impossible for him to actually win, because these indictments turn off essentially everybody. Besides the people in the hardcore MAGA base. So I don't think Donald Trump is going to lose in some LBJ-style landslide against Joe Biden in 2024. I think it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult, if not impossible, for him to actually win at this point against Joe Biden, even despite the fact that Joe Biden is very unpopular, despite the fact that the economy is recovering very slowly, despite the fact that gas is still very expensive in parts of the country. While Americans are very dissatisfied with those economic circumstances, they're still not going to choose the candidate that could potentially end up in prison. Because while Republicans sort of live in a bubble that every American thinks Donald Trump is being treated unfairly, and of course there's many arguments to be made that Donald Trump in some cases has been treated unfairly by the media and by the justice system, most Americans aren't going to buy that. And, quite frankly, it really doesn't matter in a presidential election. If Joe Biden is seen as this sort of harmless, basic Democrat by the majority of Americans, who is a little bit incompetent, a little bit old, but relatively harmless, they're going to vote for him easily over somebody who they view as a threat to democracy and somebody who's facing criminal charges. So ultimately, I think Donald Trump's general election chances are virtually done. Given this. Now, I think that's a pretty bold statement, but given everything we've seen, it would really take a massive miracle for Donald Trump to come back from this. Now, I think a lot of people's brains are broken from 2016 that Donald Trump will somehow find a way. And some people were even saying that in 2020 when Biden was up by 6 to 8 points in some of the Rust Belt states. But at the time, starting in the late summer, early fall, I think of 2020, I was saying that Joe Biden was going to beat Donald Trump, and I was right at the end of the day. I think in this case as well, it's going to take a miracle of epic proportions for Donald Trump to win the general election. So, of course, that leaves the Republican primary voters with a big question. Are they going to vote for a candidate who's almost guaranteed to lose by all conventional wisdom in 2024? Now, the answer for your standard old guard Republican would be no. Of course, they wouldn't want to vote for somebody who would almost surely lose. But Donald Trump's base itself makes it very difficult for the Republican Party to choose an alternative because they are going to support Donald Trump no matter what. And that's just the reality of the situation. Because when you're in a sphere where every news is fake news, everything against Donald Trump is a lie, perpetuated by the deep state or something like that, you're not going to believe anything you read in the media outside your trusted sources. And as a result, you have a lot of Republican voters, I think, putting their heads in the sand and ignoring the reality of the situation, that you have the leading candidate of the Republican Party facing criminal charges, is likely to go to prison, and has almost no chance at actually beating Joe Biden in the general election at this point. Again, this isn't the hush money payments indictment. I honestly don't think that was nearly as big of a deal electorally as this one, when you've got nuclear secrets involved. And again, that's the news that we're getting right now. Obviously, more news is going to come out, but the indictment does seem very serious and extremely damaging to Trump's brand overall. So it looks very likely he's going to be charged and face some sort of criminal penalty for all of this. And the real question is whether or not it's going to happen during the primary or, of course, during the general election season. Because could you imagine a situation where Donald Trump is nominated at the RNC and then in September or October ends up going to prison and having to run a general election campaign from prison? That would be sort of a 1964, maybe more of a 1992 style Democratic landslide. Because, of course, you're going to have a lot of states voting for Trump in protest against Joe Biden, but there's really no way in which he actually wins the general election if that does happen. So, again, there's a lot to be seen, but things look really bad for Donald Trump's political ambitions and just overall future, given the fact that it seems that the walls are really closing in on him. You've got a lot of his lawyers leaving. And again, a lot of the stuff Trump is saying on True Social about the case is just going to be used against him in court. And I'm sure his lawyers are pulling their hair out because of it, because it's so hard to defend somebody who continues to dig himself a deeper hole. And I think that's really Donald Trump since 2020 encapsulated. Ever since the 2020 election, he's been digging himself a deeper hole. and with investigations that, quite frankly, this federal documents case should have never happened. If Donald Trump had handled the documents properly and had been honest with the DOJ, even if you think the DOJ was coming after Trump unfairly, if he had just handed over all the documents to begin with, this case would never happen, and we wouldn't really be talking about this right now. And if you want to go back even further, if Donald Trump had conceded the 2020 election and, you didn't have January 6th, the whole fake electors thing happen, you really wouldn't be looking at any of this. And quite frankly, if Trump wasn't running for president again, you probably wouldn't have had the hush money indictments, all these other things going on for him. So he's really dug himself an extremely deep hole right now, and it's very difficult to see how he gets out of it. But of course, I want your thoughts on this as well. Leave your thoughts below in the comments. Do you think Donald Trump's 2024 ambitions are over? Do you think Donald Trump's actually going to go to prison because of all this? What do you think is the likely outcome of all of these cases? Of course, let me know down below. Anyway, that's going to be it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.